As the sun set on a war-torn Japan on August 15, 1945, the echoes of gunfire, the cries of soldiers, and the roar of military aircraft were gradually replaced by the silence of surrender. For the surviving kamikaze pilots, who had long ago traded their futures for the honor of their nation, the signing of the Japanese instrument of surrender marked not only the end of World War II, but the beginning of an unexpected and tumultuous aftermath. These young men, many of whom had been celebrated as heroes, or at least martyr-like figures within the Imperial Japanese Navy, were now left to grapple with the reality of their survival amidst a landscape of death and destruction. A narrative often overlooked in discussions surrounding the conflict. The psychological impact of their sacrificial missions, whereby they willingly took part in suicide attacks against Allied naval vessels, was profound and multifaceted, framing their existence in the post-war era within a context of survivors' guilt and a crisis of identity. To comprehend the aftermath experienced by kamikaze pilots, it is essential to understand the complete tactical and strategic framework of the campaigns that birthed them. The Japanese suicide attack strategy, a desperate response to the staggering losses inflicted by Allied forces in the Pacific theater, was born out of a perceived need to counteract overwhelming air and naval superiority. From their first instances at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944, where a concerted effort to diminish the American fleet played out with devastating effectiveness, kamikaze attacks maneuvered on the axis of despair and fanaticism. Operating under a doctrine that equated honor with sacrifice, these pilots, many teenagers, fought not merely for military objectives, but for the preservation of Japanese societal values deeply rooted in the principles of Bushido, the way of the warrior. At the crux of these attrition-based tactics was an unsettling fusion of technological limitations and cultural fervor. With a fleet of aging aircraft, often commandeered from the remnants of more capable fighter interceptors, kamikaze pilots were equipped minimally, relying on the resolve of their pilots and the incorporation of the OK flying bomb, a rocket-powered glider designed to enhance the lethality of their missions. The psychological training these pilots underwent was as formidable as the technical aspects. Indoctrinated with ideals of Japanese superiority, the notion of dying for the emperor was infused in every mission briefing. Thus, when the war drew to a disastrous close, the very essence of their being, which had been molded by a narrative of honor, was suddenly shattered, revealing disillusionment amidst a rapidly changing Japan, struggling to adjust to the consequences of total defeat. With the dissolution of their operational framework post-surrender, those kamikaze pilots who returned, or who had been too young to partake in the climactic air assaults designed to defend the homeland, found themselves in an unprecedented dilemma. The imperial military structures that once afforded them identity crumbled almost overnight, replaced by the American social and political systems emphasizing democratization and demilitarization. The psychological ramifications were acute. Many pilots returned to families that had suffered profound losses, and, in the aftermath of such tragedies, faced immense societal pressure to conform to the narrative of wartime sacrifice that had been deeply woven into Japanese culture. The tattoos on their bodies, once symbols of pride and valiance, became marks of a painful past, a reminder of battles fought that now felt irrelevant or futile. Compounded by the political and social upheavals of post-war Japan, former kamikaze pilots struggled with reintegration into civilian life. Many of them lived in a state of existential crisis, where memories of their fallen comrades haunted their thoughts, and the ghosts of the fallen loomed large like specters of failure. Rather than being revered, they encountered a mix of confusion and resentment from a populace that had borne witness to the devastation wrought by the war. As such, societal recognition of their sacrifices flickered between veneration and scorn. This volatile perception led to a fracturing of communal identity, creating a chasm between the ideals they once fought for and a reality that dictated survival at any cost was now a primary concern. To further complicate matters, the Red Purge, a wave of anti-communist measures, swept through Japan following the war, a political climate fraught with paranoia shaped by Japan's capitulation and the dichotomy of the emerging Cold War. Those who had served in the military were often viewed with suspicion, especially as the imperialistic narratives they had once espoused were recontextualized within a broader anti-nationalistic framework. In this landscape of political repression, the kamikaze pilots presented an uncomfortable contradiction for a nation striving for peace and stability. They had been warriors bound by honor and duty, yet could they be considered mere pawns of a militaristic regime that had led the nation to destruction? Many turned inward, isolating themselves from what they perceived to be a society bent on casting them as villains of a tragic epoch. Economically, the ramifications of the war also weighed heavily on the shoulders of the surviving pilots. With Japan's infrastructure decimated and resources scarce, unemployment loomed. Many pilots found themselves ill-prepared for the rigors of civilian life, having been indoctrinated and trained solely for military endeavors. Where military careers had once promised stability and reward, had now evaporated into a void, exacerbating feelings of hopelessness. The psychological weight of their past missions, combined with logistical and economic struggles, fell as a heavy shroud, disallowing any semblance of closure or redemption. As they waded through a world that bore little resemblance to the one they fought for, some sought solace in local religious or community practices, while others became the haunted conduits of their past, proclaiming the atrocities of war they had witnessed in hopes of assuaging their minds and immortalizing those they lost. As time marched on, however, the narrative surrounding kamikaze pilots began to shift, from tragic reminders of a violent past to figures of reflection in historical discourses. Oral histories began to emerge, chronicling their personal stories and hardships, shedding light on the psychological scars often left unexamined in the wake of broader military history. Those pilots who survived set out to come to terms with their actions, revealing a complex tapestry of regret, memory, and longing for redemption. In a post-war era fraught with conflict, they stood not as mere vestiges of militaristic bravery, but as representatives of a more nuanced human experience shaped by the chaos of war, their stories becoming a key to understanding the broader implications of conflict, sacrifice, and the unyielding quest for identity amid devastation. In the wake of World War II, the surviving kamikaze pilots sought to navigate a landscape eternally changed by the horrors of conflict. Their existence was no longer defined by the glory of sacrifice, but by the haunting memories of missions that had claimed countless lives, both theirs and their foes. The post-war period for these former warriors was marred not only by their actions during the war, but more importantly by the profound impact of their choices on their psyche, as these individuals grappled with the implications of their previous allegiances and the moral complexities entwined within them. At the heart of the kamikaze phenomenon was a fundamental tactical decision made by Japanese high command to utilize suicide attacks as a desperate measure to offset dwindling resources and manpower in the face of overwhelming Allied forces. By 1944, as the tide of war turned unfavorably for Japan, kamikaze tactics became a last-ditch effort to disrupt enemy operations and inflict damage on naval fleets. Each mission was underpinned by a profound sense of duty and honor, a culmination of years of indoctrination into a militaristic ethos that glorified dying for the emperor as the highest form of loyalty. However, little did they know that the very tactics implemented to uphold their nation would shape their post-war existence into an emotional battle of its own, one that was as treacherous and pervasive as any aerial dogfight they had experienced during the war. The logistics behind executing a kamikaze attack were complex and ruthlessly efficient. Pilots would undergo a rigorous selection process, their training designed to hone skills necessary for performing these suicide missions, while simultaneously instilling an almost religious fervor for Japan's imperial cause. Each flight would be meticulously planned, coordination between personnel becoming crucial as they sought to achieve maximum impact. The aircraft, typically older models in decline, were outfitted with explosives, stripped of excess weight, and readied for a one-way journey into despair, a sobering truth that characterized their existence. The desperation of the Japanese High Command to hold back the advancing tide of Allied forces led to the implementation of these tactics, ultimately culminating in the loss of thousands of young lives, some as young as 18, sacrificed in the name of loyalty, strategy, and a belief in a greater cause. As the war concluded, survivors were left not only with the aftermath of their devastating missions, but with a complex web of emotions interwoven with guilt and sorrow. The collapse of the Imperial Navy signified not only a monumental loss, but also a fracture in the ideology that had fueled their resolve. The rigorous indoctrination that firmly established their identities as warriors was now replaced with a debilitating silence, one forged from the absence of camaraderie and purpose. From a tactical viewpoint, the realization struck hard. While these missions aimed to cripple enemy morale and destroy naval power, the reversal brought devastation to Japan and left behind not glory, but mistrust, despair, and relentless questions concerning their sacrifices. Amid this tumult, the societal perception of kamikaze pilots underwent a transformation. Initially, the public revered them as heroes who had made the ultimate sacrifice. However, as Japan grappled with defeat, this sentiment shifted. Many civilians began to view the pilots with a mix of fear and contempt, seeing them not merely as victims of a cruel war, but as agents of a military machine that had spiraled into madness. For the pilots, the conflict between self-identification as loyal patriots and the societal stigma attached to their actions manifested in deep-seated psychological turmoil. The sense of being a pariah within one's own society fostered an environment where survival became not just physical, but emotional and spiritual. Adding to the complexity was the evolving historical narrative surrounding Japan's wartime actions, including the use of kamikaze tactics. Over time, historians began to revisit these stories, exploring the deeper psychological effects on those who participated. They unearthed harrowing accounts of pilots who, during their descent towards enemy ships, experienced fleeting moments of doubt about the righteousness of their cause. Interviews revealed that the expediency of their missions often masked their internal struggles, prompting reflections on mortality, the nature of duty, and the ethical ramifications of their actions. In essence, the post-war period became a critical juncture where conversations surrounding morality and sacrifice began to surface, transforming the narrative from mere glorification of war tactics to examinations of human experience forged in crisis. Furthermore, the so-called forgotten generation of pilots became emblematic of Japan's broader struggle for redemption. Those who survived were often drawn to sharing their stories, either through media interviews or published memoirs, seeking to navigate the choppy waters of societal reintegration while attempting to encapsulate the gravity of their wartime decisions. The oral histories emerging from these endeavors became valuable texts, not just for understanding the complexities of war, but for forging connections between generations still reeling from the consequences of a conflict that had altered the course of the nation. As the years slipped into decades, the surviving kamikaze pilots increasingly transitioned into roles that allowed for contemplation and healing. Some took positions as educators, offering insights into their experiences and the intricacies of warfare, hoping to steer younger generations away from the blind fervor that had characterized their own youths. Through such narratives, they endeavored to extract lessons from their war-torn past, recognizing their stories as dual-purpose legacies, warning tales tinged with regret, and reflections on the dignity lost to the ravages of war. The psychological healing process for many was not a smooth journey, but a rocky path paved with echoes of destruction. Therapy began to evolve in Japan, slowly integrating the conversation around trauma experienced by war veterans, including kamikaze pilots. Emerging from the shadows, discussions around PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the broader implications of combat-induced psychological scars began to take root in Japanese society. While grappling with their past led to community acceptance for some, others remained shrouded in a life of isolation and remoteness, haunted still by the faces of comrades who normalized the ultimate act of sacrifice for a duty that had since been tarnished. As one contemplates the lives of kamikaze pilots in their aftermath of World War II, it becomes crystal clear that their stories are not merely about maneuvers and tactics, but about the undying human spirit seeking meaning and closure amidst chaos. The legacy of these young warriors did not only end when the bombs fell or the calls for duty ceased, but continued to reverberate through societal structures, historical narratives, and the intimate psyche of humanity grappling with the shadows of war. In a world reeling from incessant conflict, their experiences serve as poignant reminders of the fragile line we walk between loyalty and madness, honor and destruction. As we continue to examine the complexities of warfare and its aftermath, let us embrace the narratives of these individuals, honoring the suffering endured, yet also reflecting on the broader implications of conflict as we strive for a more peaceful future. If you found this exploration of kamikaze pilots' legacy enlightening, consider subscribing and leaving your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement not only fosters dialogue but honors those whose lives were forever altered by the ravages of war, echoing the importance of understanding our history as a reflection of who we are today. With the final remnants of the Second World War dissolving into the annals of history, the lives of surviving kamikaze pilots unfolded into a complex tapestry of reflection, hardship, and stark reality. Emerging from wartime fervor where patriotic fervor was zealously cultivated, many of these pilots were thrust into a world that had changed drastically, both in technological and emotional dimensions. The tactical decisions made by commanders aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy vessels were predicated on a blend of desperation and initiative. The hope was to turn the tide of an unwinnable conflict with unconventional methods, sacrificing their airmen in suicide missions that were conceived as divine acts of valor. The grim realization set in. Their tactics had drafted young men into a grim dance of death, striping away their agency at the altar of nation and glory. In the last months of the war, as Japan's infrastructure crumbled under the weight of Allied bombings and naval blockades, the kamikaze strategy evolved markedly. Initially employed in the latter stages of 1944, this tactic became a desperate response to overwhelming adversaries, especially notable during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Here, a staggering number of kamikaze aircraft were launched against American fleet forces as a last-ditch effort to interrupt supply lines and draw attention away from troop landings. Commanders made pivotal decisions based on flawed intelligence assumptions, believing that the sheer volume of pilots willing to sacrifice themselves would intimidate the American commanders and yield tactical advantages. Yet the unintended consequence of such desperation further eroded the pilots' morale. Many were left questioning the honor ingrained in such a violent narrative. The blistering rhetoric surrounding death for the emperor found little solace in the fog of realization that their sacrifices had altered the trajectory of their very existence. As the war drew to a close and subsequent surrender followed, the stark reality of defeat unveiled the psychological burdens borne by those fortunate enough to return home. The societal narrative around kamikaze pilots rapidly shifted from reverence to a more complicated perception of survival. Among the survivors, feelings of betrayal arose as society attempted to frame their experience in the context of a national calamity. These young men, who had been molded into weapons against perceived enemies, found solace in each other's company but struggled with a heightened awareness of a world no longer thriving on the principles of honor and glory through sacrifice. They became witnesses to a systemic effort that vilified wartime actions. Thus, the recovery process they faced was complicated by national sentiment, intertwining their individual trauma with a collective identity marked by defeat. Reintegration into civilian life demanded navigating through layers of stigma and misconstrued pride. Reports began emerging of kamikaze pilots suffering not only from physical injuries, but debilitating psychological scars. Various studies on PTSD that would later surface in post-war society drew on these local experiences, offering insights into the crisis of consciousness faced by veterans who confronted the haunting memories of their brethren sacrificed on missions where the odds favored death rather than survival. Traditional values of honor became carbonated with guilt and disillusionment, a gaping chasm where former glory could not fill the emptiness of survival when comrades had not returned. Faced with the intricacies of adjusting to a peacetime society that had irreparably shifted in philosophy, many kamikaze pilots sought lighter roles within their communities to bury their pasts, but often found their tales trailing behind them like shadows. Within temples and shrines where wartime efforts were once heralded, voices of reflection emerged, transforming spaces of reverence into contemplative points for individuals who grappled with their histories. This ambivalence manifested in rituals where people began to commemorate the fallen, including those who executed the notoriously catastrophic missions. The examination of the kamikaze experience began to permeate literature and art, culminating in expressions of vulnerability and the plea for understanding amid cultural narratives of loyalty to country at all costs. Through these new mediums, the humanity behind the pilots' deeds surfaced, portraying them not merely as actors in the theater of war, but as individuals wrestling with conscience amidst the chains of their convictions. The echoes of mechanized warfare, the roar of aircraft engines and the silent, pressing moments just before a dive into the ocean, remained trapped within these veterans' memories. Many of them, now older and burdened with the weight of their pasts, conveyed their experiences through storytelling, helping younger generations understand the sacrifices made, while also reflecting on the futility of violent conflict. In doing so, they not only confronted their unresolved grief and guilt, but also illuminated the profound lessons that could be derived from their choices made under duress. Their narratives prompted discourse surrounding the meaning of honor, highlighting how the act of remembrance must transcend the glorification of violence, instead fostering an understanding of the transcendental partnership between life and sacrifice. As Japanese society evolved jointly with its former adversaries, this reflective journey for kamikaze veterans played a crucial role in redefining the concept of legacy. War memorials populated with flowers and prayers began to symbolize a more nuanced understanding of sacrifice, not confined to blind loyalty or martial valor, but extending to the emotional worlds of those left grappling with the attachments of loss. Reconciliation efforts highlighted the pivotal necessity of healing historical wounds, emphasizing how survivors, including kamikaze pilots, could contribute to reimagining a world where memories of war do not echo with fervent, unabated calls to arms. The focus gradually shifted from valorization of the past to embracing an ethos that cherished life, inclusivity, and understanding the scars borne by individuals on all sides of a conflict. Thus, as we revisit the stories of surviving kamikaze pilots and unravel the threads of their once prominent identities, it becomes imperative to acknowledge the layered complexities of human experience layered in an environment that glorified self-sacrifice. Their legacies compel present and future generations to confront not only the brutal realities of war, but also the profound psychological implications, imparting a crucial wisdom that the cost of honor often embraces the melancholic embrace of loss, urging an understanding of the value of human life beyond the battlefield. Through their stories, we learn that the most formidable conflict resides within ourselves, a struggle for understanding, compassion, and ultimately, peace. In the aftermath of World War II, the surviving kamikaze pilots found themselves navigating an uncharted psychological and societal landscape, fraught with the burdens of memory, guilt, and the urgency of redefining their identities beyond the mandate of sacrifice. These young men, who had once donned the mantle of revered warriors destined for a glorious demise in the service of their country, were now thrust into a reality where their actions, historically framed within the gallant myths of Japan's militaristic past, were largely seen through the lens of tragedy. The ethos of loyalty that had compelled them to engage in those perilous suicide missions morphed into an intricate struggle for self-forgiveness, as they grappled not only with their own survival, but also with the haunting memories of comrades who never returned from their fateful flights. As the Japanese nation began its post-war reconstruction, the socio-political atmosphere fostered an urgent need to recontextualize the legacy of the kamikaze, who were more than mere agents of destruction. They were individuals, often still in their teens, who had borne the weight of imperial ambition and societal expectations. The tactical backdrop of the kamikaze missions is critical in understanding the complexity of their experiences. Initially, during the latter stages of World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced insurmountable odds in the face of Allied advances. The deterioration of morale among traditional naval forces led to the emergence of kamikaze tactics as a last line of defense, a drastic shift from traditional aerial warfare strategies that prioritized skillful dogfighting and attrition. The decision to adopt suicide tactics stemmed from desperate calculations within a military hierarchy increasingly bereft of viable options. Rather than relying on conventional means of engagement, commanders sanctioned the deployment of human torpedoes that would transform young pilots into living weapons aimed at enemy ships. This transformation spotlighted the moral dilemmas inherent in the practice. As pilots like Yukio Seki undertook their training and embraced the ideology of martyrdom, a psychological conditioning took place, instilling in them a sense of honor intertwined with an inescapable fate. Seki, who was posthumously hailed as a hero, offers a stark illustration of the internalization of military propaganda, where propaganda painted the act of sacrifice in heroic strokes, overshadowing the grim reality of death and the ethical implications of their missions. The narratives of surviving kamikaze pilots assert that this militaristic indoctrination often obscured the individual's humanity, morphing them into symbolic vessels of the nation's wartime aspirations. Once the war ended, these veterans confronted the stark reality of their past. How does one reconcile the act of willingly embracing death? As they returned to civilian life amidst societal shifts toward pacifism and the questioning of nationalistic fervor, many experienced profound isolation. The dichotomy of being celebrated wartime heroes yet viewed as agents of destruction effectively alienated them from a society rejecting militaristic ideals. The psychological scars born from their experiences manifested in various ways, including survivors' guilt, depression, and anxiety. Reports of increasing mental health issues among kamikaze veterans highlighted the toll exacted by war, a burden compounded by vivid memories of the violent deaths of their fellow pilots. Yamada, another veteran, recalled the final moments of his comrades with haunting clarity, recanting battle sequences that seemed to occupy the front lines of his thoughts, anchoring him in a state of perpetual mourning and unable to embrace the freedoms won through their sacrifices. Logistically, the post-war life for kamikaze pilots was a testimony to resilience. Many struggled to acclimate to a peacetime environment, demanding a rethink of what it meant to survive. The Japanese government implemented numerous reforms aimed at reintegration, which at times felt inadequate to address the deep psychological wounds. This neglect triggered the emergence of veteran groups advocating for mental health resources and recognition of their sacrifices. Activism shaped a robust dialogue surrounding the reinterpretation of their past, emphasizing the importance of voicing their narratives as an integral part of healing. The development of war memorials became pivotal, providing platforms for remembrance that shifted from glorifying death to honoring life. In contrast, the societal narratives that emerged regarding the legacy of kamikaze pilots were complex and evolving. For every storyline that celebrated their valor, there were counter-narratives that deconstructed the notions of honor and duty as often misguided. Academics began re-examining the tactics employed during the kamikaze missions, analyzing with a critical lens the efficiency and efficacy of such a desperate measure, recognizing it as a symptom of a deeply entrenched militaristic culture rather than an embodiment of honor. This re-evaluation prompted conversations in military circles worldwide, reflecting on the implications of forcing individuals into martyrdom under dire circumstances, thereby sparking discussions on ethical warfare and the psychological toll of such warfare on individuals. As these narratives intertwined, the overall ambivalence surrounding the kamikaze experience drew conclusions not simply rooted in historical outcomes, but in explorations of human dignity. The scars of war require acknowledgement of the myriad of individual experiences, those of the pilots and their families, who likewise bore the grief of loss, yet still sought to construct lives beyond the shadow of their loved ones' sacrifices. Children of kamikaze pilots, often bearing the weight of their fathers' legacies, spoke about the inherited responsibility to share these stories, eagerly participating in platforms that sought to cultivate empathy and understanding, moving from a legacy of destruction to one that championed peace and remembrance. Ultimately, the journeys of kamikaze pilots from warrior to survivor underline a vital lesson in the aftermath of conflict. How societies reconstruct narratives of heroism intertwined with human fragility. Their ongoing struggle reiterates that the ramifications of war persist on multiple fronts. The brutal realities of those who return, faced with the echoes of their past actions and the immense loss surrounding them, highlights the essential dialogue regarding the value of life and the cost of honor. Through the retelling of their experiences, we are compelled to engage not only with military history, but also with the invaluable significance of human connection and the fragility of peace in the wake of devastation. Thus, the legacies of those kamikaze pilots continue to intertwine with the ethereal threads of memory, self-forgiveness, and ultimately, hope, inviting reflection on how we honor the past, even as we seek to step towards a more compassionate future. In the aftermath of World War II, the kamikaze pilots, emblematic of Japan's desperate measures during the final phases of the conflict, encountered an existence marked by profound disillusionment and stark identity crises. Commissioned as divine warriors, their directive was not only a military tactic, but a reflection of deeply ingrained cultural narratives surrounding honor and sacrifice. This multifaceted approach to warfare contributed intricately to their evolving legacy and the mental and emotional toll it exacted on those who survived. The strategy behind the kamikaze attacks, initially conceived under the pressures of defending an increasingly beleaguered homeland, quickly shifted from a hopeful projection of divine intervention to a palpable acknowledgement of futility in the face of overwhelming Allied advances. The mechanically precise organization of the Kamikaze Corps involved meticulous planning, reflecting the military ethos of the Imperial Japanese Navy, combating the advanced ship technology of the U.S. Navy, which had come to dominate the Pacific theater. Kamikaze tactics emerged as a drastic countermeasure. They were experiments in unorthodox warfare that sought to exploit ethical and psychological dimensions of combat. Each pilot was meticulously selected, often from younger ranks, driven by a mix of nationalistic fervor and personal circumstances. Their preparation encompassed not only the technical mastery of their aircraft, primarily the Mitsubishi Zero, but also a psychological conditioning that required them to embrace their imminent demise for the sake of the perceived glory of the emperor and their country. Significantly, the airborne ramming attacks were not enacted in isolation. They coincided with naval strategies such as the defense of the Philippines during the Leyte Gulf campaign, where kamikaze assaults were intensified amid heavy losses and resource depletion faced by the imperial forces. In the haze of battle, the rationale behind these attacks revolved around a fierce belief in self-sacrifice positioned as nobility. This operational fervor clashed against the sailors and soldiers of the U.S. forces, who grappled with the perils of their offensive maneuvers, a monumental task emphasizing survival and fortitude under the constant specter of impending death from above. The resulting waves of kamikaze planes revealed a paradox in warfare. The more desperate the measure, the more acute the resulting casualties on both sides. By the war's end, more than 3,800 kamikaze pilots were sent on seemingly endless missions, driven to confront armored vessels and human life with suicidal resolve, and yet they faced diminishing returns, evoking a haunting horror of sacrifice devoid of strategic victory. The question of what happened to the kamikaze pilots who survived this cataclysm paints a heart-wrenching picture of individuals returning to a Japan attempting to stitch its fractured reality back together post-war. For those who had experienced the valor of their missions, there was a profound disillusionment upon discovering the true repercussions of their actions. surviving kamikaze pilots faced an ethical reckoning. They were hailed as heroes, but often felt like ghosts in their own nation. The consequences of flying these fateful missions bore a desolate weight, leading many to suffer psychological trauma, manifesting in what is recognized today as post-traumatic stress disorder. The societal expectations imposed on these survivors, underscored by the imprinted belief of honor through total sacrifice, spiraled into a complex web of guilt, pride, and alienation in a society attempting to redefine itself in the aftermath of militaristic fervor. Logistically, returning kamikaze pilots found their roles within a transformed society, where war was no longer glorified but scrutinized through the lens of devastation and loss. Japan, in ruins, demanded rebuilding but also sought to reconcile the identity lost through militaristic ambitions. The narratives surrounding kamikaze pilots began to shift from a glorified romanticism of sacrifice to a more sobering reflection of the costs incurred by warfare. The very essence of national identity required introspection. No longer could the past be accepted without a critical examination of its underlying motives and results. Families of kamikaze pilots grappled with their legacies as well, often caught in the tumult of public sentiment that ranged from reverence for the sacrifices made to disdain toward the overarching militaristic regime that pushed their loved ones into such desperate acts. Many bereaved families strove to find meaning in the chaos, grounding themselves within the stories shared by returned pilots as they recounted their harrowing experiences in attempts to provide a semblance of closure to empathy-starving listeners willing to engage with a painful history. Mothers, spouses, and distant relatives of kamikaze pilots found themselves in dialogues of reconciliation. The children, inheriting the dual legacy of heroism and trauma, sought paths that transcended the wartime narrative and repositioned familial identities within the framework of peace-building efforts. Amid these tough realities, reconciliation emerged not merely as a personal journey, but as a collective responsibility extending to the wider fabric of society. This poignant transformation nudged Japan toward a stance of pacifism, reflected in its post-war constitution that renounced war as a means to settle disputes. Over years of societal reform and reformation, the influence of the kamikaze phenomenon, once seen as the apex of loyalty to the emperor, morphed into a moral conversation about the value of life, questioning the very core of duty and honor when entangled with consequences of severe loss. As exhibits of recollections surfaced, ranging from personal accounts in memoirs, scholarly articles, and documentaries, surviving kamikaze pilots gradually found solace in the retelling of their stories, shaping a legacy that underscored human frailty in the relentless pursuit of valor and glory. Healing through memory became an instrumental process, inviting broader discussions on compassion amidst devastation. By embracing their pasts, survivors broke the chains that bound them to a singular narrative of honor in death. The story of those who flew, survived, and returned maps out a complex psychological terrain of beliefs, sacrifices, and reflexivity regarding the paths taken in the crucible of war. Ultimately, this investigation into the lives of kamikaze pilots invites viewers to contemplate the paradox of duty against humanity, asking difficult questions about the impersonal nature of conflict while encouraging deeper engagement with the emotional and moral dilemmas rooted within modern warfare. The repercussions of their sacrifices resonate not just within historical contexts, but echo into contemporary discussions about understanding those caught in the throes of political ambition and personal sacrifice. As we remember their stories, the thread of empathy stitches together a narrative transcending time, urging generations to reflect on the cost of war and its everlasting impact on individual lives and cultural identity. Thus, the tale of the surviving kamikaze pilots stands as a silent yet poignant reminder, one equally relevant today, as we confront the ethical landscapes of warfare. For those wishing to explore more on the topics of World War II and the personal narratives that emerged from this time, consider subscribing for updates. We invite suggestions for new themes and stories that deserve to be uncovered and told within this historical saga. In the final phases of World War II, as the war's devastation spread across the Pacific, the Japanese military found itself grappling with diminishing resources and a strategic landscape that was increasingly unfavorable. The introduction of the kamikaze tactic demonstrated not only the desperation of the Imperial Japanese Navy, but also a profound commitment to the emperor and the nation. As losses mounted on the ground and at sea, particularly after the catastrophic defeats at Midway and Leyte Gulf, the kamikaze units became both a last resort and a symbol of hope, albeit a grim one. The pilots, often young and fervently devoted, were trained to consider their missions as holy sacrifices, forced into a morally complex labyrinth where notions of duty, honor, and death coalesced into a singular act of valor aimed at inflicting as much damage upon their enemies as possible. This commitment to their missions entailed a rigorous and harrowing training process. Many of these pilots underwent a crash course in aviation, combining both hand-picked flight training along with intensive indoctrination sessions that reinforced their roles as warriors defending Japan. They learned the intricacies of their aircraft, often outdated models like the Nakajima Ki-43 or the A6M0, both of which struggled against the superior technology of their American counterparts. Although these aircraft were initially among the most agile and lethal, the pilots faced staggering odds. By mid-1945, they were up against heavily armored ships that were equipped with advanced anti-aircraft systems and escort fighters. This significant power imbalance heightened the complexity of each mission. Kamikaze tactics forced pilots into treacherous conditions at high speed, often resulting in split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and certain death. As the pilots embarked on their missions, they were infused with a sense of purpose, buoyed by the societal ethos that valor in death would secure their place in history and earn their family's honor, a deeply embedded belief anchored in Bushido, the way of the warrior. Each aircraft was typically laden with explosives and fueled to capacity, making each sortie a rolling bomb. Upon emerging from the skies, the pilots faced imposing American warships adorned with protective nets and layered defenses. The sight of the sprawling fleet, stationed to defend against airborne incursions, evoked a spectrum of emotions: fear, dread, and an indomitable resolve. The iconic image of a kamikaze pilot hurtling downwards towards an oblivious battleship encapsulates the harrowing decisions made in the fleeting moments leading up to impact. When one crosses the threshold of mortality, the intricacies of psychological pressure take center stage. Each pilot's journey was often fraught with internal conflict. Apprehensions of failure wrestled against the indoctrinated ethos of sacrifice. They were aware, on some level, of both the grim fate they were about to face and the warriors that they believed they needed to become. The legacy of their actions, ultimately, would rip through the fabric of history. This escalation of kamikaze missions raised questions about military strategy and resource allocation. As alliances shifted and the Allies made substantial advances, the effectiveness of these implanted tactics was hotly debated within the military ranks. Some commanders, like Admiral Onishi, staunchly supported the kamikaze campaign as a necessary evil, contemplating it as the Japanese form of turning the tide in a conflict spiraling out of control. Others, however, viewed this as a profound waste of human life and fighting potential, failing to see the long-term ramifications of employing young men in a one-way strategy that offered little to no hope of successful outcomes. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest that approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots launched attacks from 1944 to 1945, many on suicide missions. The emotional toll extended far beyond the battlefield. Surviving pilots faced the daunting task of reintegrating into a society that revered their bravery, yet simultaneously mourned the staggering loss of life. The societal perception, however, varied. While some regarded them with reverence, others saw them as victims of an unforgiving war, a war cultivated by a leadership disconnected from the true horrors faced by those on the front lines. The psychological scars left on these individuals were profound, and the juxtaposition of honor and sorrow complicated their narratives of survival. In the aftermath of the war, the surviving kamikaze pilots encountered an identity crisis of unprecedented proportions. Many returned to find a Japan ravaged by the collective trauma of war, where traditional values clashed with the realities of a post-war society in turmoil. The shift from glorified heroism to the stark realities of guilt and loss forced them to reassess their roles within this new world. Stripped of the uniformity of service, these men became individuals, grappling with the moral implications of their past actions, the weight of their decisions, the lives lost, the families shattered, and the legacy of their cause lingered like a specter, both haunting and guiding them as they sought to contribute to a society eager to rebuild its shattered identity. The stories that emerged from these pilots revealed a plethora of coping mechanisms employed to navigate their trauma. Some found solace in journaling, channeling their tumultuous emotions and reflections into written accounts that provided glimpses into their turbulent mental states. Others sought community, gathering to share their tales in an effort to find mutual understanding and healing amongst fellow veterans. This network emerged as a potent reminder that even amongst sacrifice, the threads of humanity could still weave strong ties of support, encouraging dialogue around the pain and loss experienced in the war's wake. A critical voice in this unfolding narrative was the rise of post-war literature that aimed to humanize the kamikaze pilots. Books and documentaries began to surface, illuminating the psychological and emotional landscapes of these soldiers, stirring public curiosity and historical inquiry into the motivations and feelings underlying their fateful decisions. Such works compelled society to confront the deeper moral quandaries of warfare. How does one reconcile the ideals of patriotism with the inexorable toll of human life? The evolving narrative urged even the most hardened souls to perceive the kamikaze pilots not merely as instruments of despair, but as complex individuals steeped in the intricate ballet of human emotion, ambition, and vulnerability. As the world moved briskly into the latter half of the 20th century, the legacy of the kamikaze pilots continued to serve as a salient reminder of the complexities inherent in warfare. Questions of honor, sacrifice, and humanity persistently echo through generations. No longer mere footnotes in the annals of military history, these narratives became a critical lens through which future conflicts would be examined, urging deeper consideration of the moral implications of duty weighed against the irreplaceable value of life itself. In the larger tapestry of World War II, the surviving kamikaze pilots represent an imperative conversation about the human condition amidst the impersonal brutality of war, urging observers to reflect upon the lingering scars borne not just by the fallen, but profoundly by those who returned. The aftermath of World War II saw a significant transformation in Japan's national psyche, particularly for the surviving kamikaze pilots who had participated in one of the most extreme and controversial military tactics of the conflict. As the war concluded, the national narrative began to shift. The kamikaze were initially revered as embodiments of supreme sacrifice and honor, with their actions celebrated in propaganda. However, as the dust of war settled, the stark realities of what this sacrifice entailed prompted a deeper introspection among both veterans and civilians. For the kamikaze pilots who returned, those who narrowly escaped their fateful missions or were spared by circumstance, their stories did not end with their dramatic dive-bombing assaults on Allied naval vessels. Instead, they faced an uncertain life infused with guilt, confusion, and a struggle to reconcile their experiences with the realities of peace. The transition from war to peacetime was marred by profound emotional turmoil. Many of these individuals returned to a Japan grappling with defeat and destruction. The impact of this defeat was not merely physical, evident in the ruins of bombed cities and the staggering loss of life, but psychological, altering the very fabric of Japanese society. The kamikaze pilots, once celebrated as symbols of divine commitment to the emperor and nation, now faced a populace questioning the validity of such extreme nationalistic fervor. The raucous parades and heroic accolades that had once accompanied their missions were replaced with whispers of futility and horror. The collective grief consumed the air, drowning out the glory of sacrifice with sobering silence. Many kamikaze navigated this landscape like specters, haunted by the knowledge that their peers had perished in fiery combat while they had returned, even if survival came at the cost of profound internal conflict. In military terms, the kamikaze tactics emerged from a desperate need during the escalating crisis of the Pacific Theater. By 1944, Japan faced increasing difficulties in combating the overwhelmingly superior resources and numerical advantages of the Allied forces. Fleet engagements had shifted, and conventional methods of surface combat were leading to heavy losses. The naval defeats at the Battle of Leyte Gulf and subsequent confrontations underscored the dire situation. As resources dwindled and training capabilities collapsed, the Imperial Japanese Navy implemented the kamikaze tactics, which deviated from traditional strategic doctrines centered around combined arms and air superiority. Instead, they relied on the finality of individual sacrifice. This tactical evolution represented not only a shift in military doctrine, but also an admission of limitations, echoing a pervasive sense of despair that permeated the ranks. What followed was a chilling statistical dance. Each mission planned meant determining the likelihood of successful engagements against fortified Allied positions. As young pilots prepared for their missions, they often were faced with mathematical certainties. The odds were statistically against them, and as the Allies improved their countermeasures, both technologically and tactically, the veneer of invincibility that had cloaked these suicide missions began to erode. Detailed reports began to project that nearly 3,800 kamikaze pilots initiated sorties in the final stages of the war, achieving success only in a fraction of those assaults. For many who survived, these numbers carried heavy burdens. Each figure represented not just loss of life, but a cascade of emotions marking their actions as fruitless, accentuating the sense of hopelessness that clouded their post-war existence. Among the surviving kamikaze, the challenges were not solely psychological. Many struggled to reintegrate into a society that could not fully understand their motivations or sacrifices. The social stigmas attached to their actions tainted their relationships and livelihood prospects. While some felt compelled to articulate their stories, attempting to shed light on the complexities and nuances of their choices, others became reclusive, preferring silence over an unwelcome reminder of their past. In interviews conducted in the years following the war, these veterans often recounted moments of raw fear and exhilaration as their planes hurled toward targets, yet they also expressed profound sorrow for those whose fates were irrevocably altered. Battling with survivors' guilt, they questioned the very fabric of honor intertwined with their missions, leading to a multi-layered crisis of identity, a question of who they were beyond the title of kamikaze pilot. The organizational structures that once celebrated them now seemed anathema. The growing acknowledgement of the senseless loss brought about reflection within the former military as well. Japanese historians and military analysts soon began to critique the tactics employed during the war, proposing a re-evaluation of the kamikaze strategy. The actions of the pilots were debated extensively, leading to a range of interpretations that influenced the decade following the war. In this discourse, views varied from strict admiration to accusations of exploitation by military leaders. This complexity mirrored the conflicted nature of the returning veterans. The ties between revered duty and the future legacy of their actions created a tempestuous sea of commentary, much like the tumultuous waves they had faced in their last seconds before impactful descent. Not only did they grapple with internal struggles, but their ability to foster relationships bore the scars of war. Many found solace in veteran communities, albeit with varying degrees of acceptance. The camaraderie that had bound them in the heat of battle often transformed into a complicated web of shared trauma and differing perspectives on mortality. As Japan started to redefine its national identity, so too did the experiences of these pilots shape narratives surrounding peace and memory. In essence, their struggle culminated not merely in personal torment, but transformed into a broader societal dialogue on violence, loss, and reconciliation. Post-war Japan's efforts to reconstruct its national identity hinged on reconciling its previous militaristic stances with a pacifist constitution that emerged under American influence. However, the voices of Kamikaze veterans provided a critical counterpoint to these narratives, imbuing discussions on war ethics with raw, lived experiences. The outcome of these reflections redefined the cultural remembrance of World War II and reshaped notions of heroism and honor, as the kamikaze became symbols not just of sacrifice, but of the profound human cost of war, reminders that would reverberate through generations. As society wrestled with its past, the surviving kamikaze pilots emerged as a poignant testament to the complexities of duty, belonging, and the overarching human condition, a saga that would demand continuous exploration and examination long after the war had faded into history. In the aftermath of World War II, the surviving kamikaze pilots found themselves enveloped in a complex web of societal expectations, personal trauma, and a redefined national identity. Within the context of a nation grappling with its wartime legacy, the pilots' experiences became not only personal, but profoundly collective, as they confronted the tangible remnants of their past while navigating the ideological shift towards pacifism. The kamikaze, a term synonymous with suicide attacks, embodies a unique tactical approach born out of desperation, as Japan's military fortunes waned in the face of overwhelming Allied superiority. Initially conceived as a means to counterbalance the Allied naval forces, the kamikaze strategy was marked by a chilling calculus: the acknowledgement that the loss of pilot lives was an acceptable sacrifice for potentially devastating impacts on enemy fleets. This tactical realignment necessitated meticulous training, psychological conditioning, and logistical support, all of which reflected both a shift in military strategy and a dire understanding of the stakes at play. The training for these pilots was not merely technical, it involved indoctrination into a culture of sacrifice. Trainees underwent rigorous drills that aimed to prepare them mentally for their missions, which often involved flying obsolete aircraft laden with explosives directly into enemy ships. The emotional toll of such an undertaking was immense, as the pilots were positioned between the honor of duty and the inevitability of death. Many were young, some even teenagers, imbued with a sense of loyalty to the emperor that transcended individual existence. This cultural underpinning of their missions added an additional layer of complexity to their post-war narratives, as returning veterans reconciled their heroic ideals with the harsh realities of survival in a society that was rapidly re-evaluating its perspectives on warfare. Logistically, the kamikaze missions were as much an exercise in despair as they were in military strategy. The Japanese military was often forced to mobilize aging aircraft, such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 or the less sophisticated Kyushu J7W, which reflected the dwindling resources available as the war stretched on. Fuel shortages, the prioritization of different combat efforts, and declining industrial capabilities further complicated these operations. As the war dragged into its final stages, the frequency and intensity of kamikaze attacks became a desperate lashing out against an invincible foe. Each mission embodied a combination of bravery and resignation, where young men soared into the skies with the knowledge that many would meet their fate within moments of engagement. As Japan surrendered in 1945, the implications for the surviving kamikaze pilots were profound and multifaceted. The immediate aftermath saw many veterans struggling with a dual identity. Once celebrated as warriors willing to die for the national cause, they now faced the stigma of defeat. Human emotions ran the gambit from guilt and shame to alienation and betrayal. The new peace constitution, which advocated for pacifism, contrasted starkly with the violent legacy of their past, prompting many to withdraw from society and seek reclusive lives, far removed from the ideologies that had previously defined their existence. The societal reluctance to confront the brutalities of war manifested in the memories of these pilots, who found themselves fighting an internal battle that fused their experiences with the narratives forced upon them by a reformed Japan. The pilots were not just figures of military strategy. They became symbols of an era riddled with contradictions. As Japan pursued a path of economic recovery and global reintegration, the kamikaze legacy simmered beneath the societal surface, an unspoken acknowledgement of personal sacrifice that conflicted with broader national aspirations. The voices of these surviving pilots expressed a myriad of sentiments, fighting through PTSD, attempting to find meaning in their sacrifices, and seeking solace in the camaraderie that had defined their last moments in combat. Veterans associations, formed as a means of support, evolved into networks that enabled them to share horror stories and experiences, ultimately binding them in a shared understanding of survival. Yet, the mutual recognition of past glory was complicated. The value placed on their missions became a topic of heated debate. The societal reverence clashing with feelings of despair over their actions bred a sense of disillusionment, as many pilots found it difficult to reconcile their roles as instruments of destruction with their aspirations for a peaceful future. Amidst these struggles, the individual stories of kamikaze pilots unfolded into poignant reflections on heroism, honor, and loss. Each pilot was a tapestry of varied emotions, histories, and motivations that offered a broader perspective on the complexities of warfare. The conventional narrative of martyrdom struggled with the realities of survival. Those who returned were met with a society that sought to redefine honor away from violence. As the government and educational institutions began to espouse peace and reconciliation, the legacy of the kamikaze became intertwined with both a cautionary tale of the perils of nationalism and an exploration of the depths of human commitment. The duality of their existence presented a unique challenge in post-war Japan, as the kamikaze pilots became unwilling avatars, reflecting the limits of sacrifice fated within the whirlpool of ideologies. The narrative of glory associated with their missions was challenged by the stark realities of ruined families, lost friendships, and the unshakable burden of survival amid collective mourning. Each memoir, testimony, and expression of thought from these pilots captured the toll of conflict and resonated deeply within the broader public consciousness. Thus, the untold aftermath of the kamikaze pilots is not merely a chronicle of military might, but an intricate examination of the human condition in conflict, a reflection on how the scars of war imprint themselves on national identities long after the battles have ceased. Their legacies serve as stark reminders of the complexities surrounding duty and sacrifice, forcing society to confront the uncomfortable history that still lingers. As Japan envisioned a future defined by peace, the voices of the kamikaze pilots tangled into the discourse of memory, re-illuminating the shadows cast by wartime folly and allowing newer generations to witness both the valor and tragedy of those lost flights into oblivion. The enduring challenge lies in ensuring their stories are neither romanticized nor silenced, allowing for an honest narrative that respects the intricate tapestry of life, death, and everything that arises in between. In the aftermath of World War II, the societal landscape of Japan underwent a profound transformation, one that was shaped significantly by the legacy of the kamikaze pilots. These young men, once celebrated as embodiments of honor and courage, faced a disorienting return to a homeland that had suffered immense devastation, yet now clamored for peace. The military strategies employed by the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had once glorified the sacrificial dive-bombing tactics of the kamikaze, seemed to contradict the contemporary push towards reconciliation and rebuilding. The extreme measures of the suicide attacks, initially birthed from a desperate response to adversity, soon morphed into a complex enigma, as both ex-pilots and society grappled with the implications of their past actions. The psychological profile of these pilots reveals a deep conflict, as many returned survivors were haunted not just by the ghosts of their fallen comrades, but by the erosion of the very principles they had fought to uphold. The strategic employment of kamikaze tactics during the closing stages of the war was born of a grim pragmatism. Japan's dwindling resources left no room for traditional dogfights or protracted engagements. By late 1944, Allied forces had inflicted severe damage on Japan's naval capabilities, and the once dominant Japanese fleet began to crumble under sustained assaults. It was this dire situation that led High Command to sanction the desperate measures encapsulated in the Kamikaze Doctrine, a calculated yet reckless choice aimed at inflicting maximum psychological and material damage on the American fleet. The result was a new form of warfare, wherein a young pilot, often barely trained and filled with an indoctrinated sense of purpose, would turn his aircraft into a lethal weapon targeting enemy ships. Each mission, imbued with the ethos of honor and sacrifice, involved rigorous preparations, from meticulous flight path planning to honing their knowledge of the enemy's fleet formations. As these pilots embarked on their final missions, the very act of flying transformed into an intense ritual laden with heavy symbolism. The pilots were not merely executing orders, they were flying under a banner of unwavering loyalty, often guided by a blend of patriotic fervor and deep-seated fear of dishonor. The psychological dynamics at play embedded themselves into the fabric of their actions. As the war progressed, some kamikaze pilots began to harbor doubts about their mission, weighed down by the realization that their ultimate sacrifice might not alter the course of the inevitable defeat. A combination of social pressure, loyalty to comrades, and the prevailing military doctrine created a potent cocktail that often led them to view death as the only escape from a burgeoning sense of hopelessness. Their return, however, painted a starkly different picture, as these surviving pilots faced the grim reality of living within a society that was reshaping its identity while reconciling the specters of its militaristic past. The complex narrative surrounding these individuals did not merely dwell on their military exploits, but delved deep into their post-war psychological manifestations. Many survivors reported feelings of survivor's guilt, grappling with the burden of returning home while their friends perished in what were often ill-fated missions. The societal expectation to embody the wartime spirit clashed with the emerging discourse of reconciliation and peace. As Japan sought to redefine its identity in the wake of its defeat, the narrative of glory surrounding the kamikaze began to shift toward a cautionary tale, a reflection on the consequences of extreme nationalism and the horrors of war. This societal evolution included a significant alteration in educational discourse. Schools began to replace the hallowed narratives of sacrifice with lessons emphasizing peace, cooperation, and the dangers of fanaticism. Textbooks reshaped history to promote reconciliation rather than glorification of past militarism. Additionally, the pacifist constitution introduced by the American occupation further redefined national values, urging citizens to embrace diplomacy over aggression. Within this context, the surviving kamikaze pilots found themselves in a perplexing limbo. They were neither honored nor wholly condemned. Instead, they became relics of a bygone era, figures whose experiences did not easily fit into the new ideological mold. As their stories trickled through memoirs, interviews, and community conversations, the surviving pilots faced the added trial of public perception. Some chose to recount their experiences, seeking to share the horrors of war and the futility of their missions, while others remained silent, their trauma too profound to articulate. The burden of memory weighed heavily on their shoulders as they became the carriers of collective trauma, not merely for themselves but for a nation wrestling with its own identity. The generational gap between those who lived through the war and the younger populace, who increasingly embraced peace, caused additional strain. Many school children in post-war Japan viewed the kamikaze with a mixture of pity and confusion. What had once been glorified ideals drifted into the realm of cautionary tales, illustrating the depths of sacrifice while also serving as warnings against blind nationalism. Administrative decisions regarding how to memorialize kamikaze pilots also highlighted the complex relationship that survivors maintained with their history. Memorials erected in their honor often faced criticism for promoting glorification over reflection. Many argued that these monuments should serve not as reminders of valor, but as potent symbols of the costs of war, ensuring that future generations would learn from the past rather than repeat its mistakes. This internal conflict further complicated the brothers-in-arms legacy, as the push towards modernization and normalization often clashed with the haunting memories of those who gave everything only to return to a society that had rewritten its narrative in terms of peace. In summary, the aftermath of the Kamikaze pilot's experiences intertwines military history with profound social implications, encapsulating the human cost of war. Each story, whether of glory, regret, or reflection, provides insight into the complex dynamics of duty, sacrifice, and ultimately survival in a post-war society. The enduring memories of these young men distort the binary of heroism and cowardice, painting a multifaceted picture of a nation that has struggled to reconcile its past with the dreams set forth in its future. As Japan gradually distances itself from the ideologies that fueled the war, the voices of the surviving kamikaze pilots remain crucial in their challenge to honor the past, while simultaneously crafting a future where such sacrifices need not recur. Their narratives serve as historical anchors, urging contemplation on how narratives of duty, honor, and sacrifice can both elevate and, paradoxically, subdue the human spirit in the theater of war. As the echoes of World War II faded into the annals of history, the remaining kamikaze pilots found themselves navigating an altered social landscape that reshaped their understanding of sacrifice and valor. The drastic shift in Japan's focus, from a war-fueled fervor towards a prioritized pacifism, was perplexing, and it forced these individuals, who were heralded as heroic martyrs, into a phase of deep introspection about their past choices. Surviving kamikaze pilots, such as those from the famed 201st Naval Air Group, often experienced a conflicted existence entrenched in the paradox of their former roles as instruments of national glory and their current lives as reminders of horrific losses. Their stories do not merely reflect the heroics perpetuated in wartime narrative, but also provide a lens into the agonizing human toll that such war tactics exacted, along with the overwhelming burden of observing a society in transition. Operationally, the kamikaze strategy itself, first conceptualized in 1944, was rooted in desperation. As Japan faced mounting losses in the Pacific theater and an increasingly potent Allied presence, military leaders devised the suicide attack method as a last-ditch effort to stave off defeat. It was seen as a means of offsetting the technological and numerical advantages of U.S. forces. Pilots were trained swiftly, often with limited training time, emphasizing crucial takeoffs, targeting procedures, and the mechanics of their aircraft, primarily the famed Mitsubishi Zero, while disregarding traditional combat tactics. The sheer audacity of these mission profiles meant that the young men piloting these planes were thrust into a harrowing reality, where patriotism superseded personal survival. This regimental enthusiasm was cultivated in a militaristic culture that predated the war, and was deeply fascinated with honor, courage, and willingness to sacrifice oneself for the emperor. The statistics of the kamikaze campaign are starkly illuminating. According to Japanese military records, about 3,800 kamikaze pilots were deployed in the final phases of the war, with a significant operational focus between 1944 and 1945. The target was clear: Allied naval vessels. Using small-scale air operations as a force multiplier against the more numerically superior U.S. Navy, the kamikaze could inflict substantial damage, exemplified during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where these attacks wreaked havoc on American warships. Yet, despite the transient tactical victories, the overall strategy was indicative of a desperate military leadership running out of conventional options. As the war drew to a close and Japan's military fabric unraveled, surviving pilots were confronted with an existential crisis that transcended military defeat. Upon the war's end, the immediate aftermath was tumultuous for many former kamikaze pilots. Those who returned home grappled with their identities. Having been indoctrinated into a service of violent sacrifice, they now bore the scars of not just physical wounds, but psychological ones. The homecoming was marked by an overwhelming sense of alienation. The prevailing narrative of honor had morphed into one of tragedy and loss. Kamikaze missions, once glorified by war propaganda, were increasingly viewed through a critical lens, prompting deeper scrutiny of the military strategies employed and the overall implications of such drastic actions. The irony of surviving a mission designed explicitly for self-sacrifice left many grappling with the meaning of survival itself. Their experiences, initially framed as the apex of loyalty, evolved into poignant reminders of the price paid for nationalistic fervor. In negotiating this complex emotional terrain, many former pilots sought to exorcise the memories of their wartime service. This was not merely an individual struggle, but a collective endeavor, as the broader Japanese society sought to integrate the lessons of war into a narrative of peace. Memorials and monuments became focal points in communities. However, they elicited divided responses, some viewing them as essential landmarks of homage, while others lamented the glorification of a practice that symbolized a tragic loss of life. Here, a significant challenge emerged: the tension between honoring those who died while questioning the ideologies that had pushed them to their demise. Logistically, post-war life presented bleak realities. Many pilots faced difficulties reintegrating into civilian life. Jobs were scarce, and with the economy in disarray, the burdens of providing for families compounded the psychological trauma of having lived through the war. In some instances, these individuals struggled silently, their stories unresolved and haunting. While some actively sought platforms to share their narratives, often emphasizing the futility of the kamikaze mission, others remained silent, feeling overburdened by the expectations of a society that had begun to rewrite its narratives towards peace. This silence oftentimes manifested into echoes of regret, feelings of betrayal by a government that once exalted their missions. The socio-political atmosphere of post-war Japan magnified these internal struggles. As the U.S. occupation reformed the Japanese constitution, introducing democratic ideals and a pacifist national identity, discussions surrounding the military's glorified past took precedence. Many surviving kamikaze pilots, as well as society at large, were confronted with the painful reflection of their actions. This gave rise to a generation that sought to emerge from the shadows of its militaristic past and embrace a new identity, a peace-seeking nation grounded in democratic principles. With this transformation came the painful yet liberating acknowledgement of past mistakes, a bittersweet reconciliation with histories marred by violence. In contemporary Japan, discussions surrounding the enduring legacy of the kamikaze pilots reflect a broader, ongoing quest for national identity. Surviving pilots, now elderly, often serve as living testaments to the complex interplay of duty, sacrifice, and the human experience during wartime. Their narratives contribute to dialogues exploring the implications of nationalism, military pride, and collective memory. As they endeavor to impart the lessons of their experiences to younger generations, the emphasis remains squarely on the potential for peace, a compelling counter-narrative to the glorification of sacrifice in service to the state. Through their reflections, they embody the crux of what it means to survive, aligning it not with virtue but with the ethical duty to honor lives lost by fostering understanding, compassion, and a commitment to preventing the recurrence of such devastating conflicts in the future. The call remains a poignant reminder within Japan's ongoing journey toward healing, while illuminating the deep scars left on a society navigating the tumultuous path from war to peace.